one thing I was often told when I was much younger is, this is just how India is. That was sort of like when I asked a question, that was the response. And I think I wanted students to feel a sense of, just feel like they can challenge the status quo and should, right? They should be able to sort of construct the world they want to live in.
Welcome to the Anahita Speaker Series presented by Carnegie India, celebrating stirring stories of empowerment, struggle, and success from the women professionals in different fields across the globe, bound to inspire young professionals. I'm Akash Bhutani, Program Coordinator and Research Assistant at Carnegie India, and today I'll be speaking to Kulika Reddy, Acting Director of the Human Rights Clinic at Columbia Law School, and also the founder and director of Schools of Equality. She has conducted human rights advocacy around the world, including India, Kashmir, Yemen, and Papua New Guinea. Her work has focused on inequality, discrimination, armed conflict, peace building, and the role of education in unlearning bias and fostering inclusion. We are privileged to have Golika with us today. Golika, welcome to the Anahita Speaker Series. Before we delve deep into the conversation, let me start this by asking you that what really inspired you to pursue law in the first place? And maybe shed some light on your work and the journey so far.
Yeah, so I think I wanted to become a lawyer before I fully really understood what it meant to be a lawyer. I think you're often asked, what do you want to be when you grow up, when you haven't fully had the time to reflect on what that question is. And I think from a young age, I think one thing that I was sort of frustrated with was the normalization of identity-based harms in India. So just the fact that people experience discrimination just because of some aspect of who they were, whether it was, gender or caste or religion or sexuality. And I, at the time thought that the knowledge of law would be empowering, or that it would be a powerful instrument for social change, which is what motivated me to go to law school. And, of course, I quickly realized the law is not enough. And a lot of my work since has involved sort of working at the intersection of law, but also other disciplines.
You already touched upon this a bit, but while you were practicing law in India, what were some of the major deep-rooted problems that you came across, either through your personal experience or what you saw in the community?
Yeah, so I think that, I started with quite a strong focus on litigation, focused on in cases involving gender-based violence. And although the laws and constitutional safeguards were clear, and there's been, a lot of progress over the years related to some of those laws, I found that there needed to be a range of other enabling conditions for people to actually be able to access justice. So, whether it's access to rights awareness or access to representation, or also just a more sensitized judicial environment. So I think one of the challenges I found that was definitely deep-rooted and is not just limited to the judiciary, but we see it, across society, is just attitudes towards women or gender roles or towards other marginalized identity groups. So, even if the domestic violence law is clear, often I would find women who came to court being told to just adjust to their circumstances, like, oh, think about your children, think about this, think about that. And, or, there was a case in the Madras High Court where a rape victim was asked to marry her rapist as a form of compromise, or women being told to sort of use mediation with a rape case to arrive at an amicable settlement. And I then moved into capacity building workshops, or alongside litigation, capacity building workshops for lawyers, judges, police. And I found that some of these attitudes begin from a very young age based on how we're socialized. So I remember there was a lawyer who shared that he didn't have any sisters. He went to a boys' school. So often if he was interested in a girl, he did what he followed, what he saw in Bollywood, which was if she said no, he thought that meant try harder and was essentially stalking women. Or I remember there was a family lawyer who shared that she got into family law to save the institution of marriage. And when we were having conversations about, but what does that mean in the context of abuse within a marriage and things like that, I think, she said, at that point, I guess I'm still young, but at that point I was even younger. And she said, you're young, you don't understand just like the sanctity of marriage. And and essentially what I recognized is this is a lesson that she was raised with, and it was a lesson that she was passing on to her children. And I think it was sort of at that stage that I realized that, these attitudes are just a function of the institutions we grow up in, the messaging that we receive, and the ways in which we're socialized. And I wanted to focus not just on how do you address an issue after it has taken place. A lot of my work prior had been focused on how do you strengthen legal response mechanisms, I set up a network of free legal aid lawyers, and did a lot of the rights awareness workshops to address some of the earlier concerns that I raised. But I realized I also wanted to focus on prevention of the issue, and that given that socialization around gender and other dimensions of identity begins so early, I wanted to start with much younger children. And that's when I started Schools of Equality. And it's a nonprofit that runs experiential programs in schools with the aim to shift attitudes that perpetuate not just gender-based violence, but other forms of identity-based harms.
Well, I believe most of the problems that you mentioned continue to persist and are very much prevalent across India. So I understand that in order to prevent these problems, you came up with the idea of schools of equality. So can you tell us a little bit more about this organization of yours, and what has been the vision so far behind schools of equality? What has your experience been with parents, teachers, and even students when you speak about the so-called taboo subjects? And lastly, how have you dealt with any sort of resistance from parents or teachers?
So, I've really loved it. So I think it's, just as I said when I was growing up, I would say I wanted to be a lawyer. So I think on my decisive days, I would say I want to be a lawyer. And on my indecisive days, I would say, I don't know what I want to be, but I know I don't want to be a teacher. And it's funny because a lot of my work at Schools of Equality involves that. And my role right now, I teach at Columbia, and it's actually the aspect of my job that I enjoy the most. And I think it's because it's sort of like a space for hope and possibility, as opposed to, I really find the other aspects of my human rights work incredibly meaningful. But, with human rights work, often it's, change is slow and incremental. But I think with Schools of Equality, which I'll describe a little bit more now, I've been able to actually see some of that transformation and action that students take. So the vision of the organization really is, as I said, how do you engage with very young students about equality and identity from a really young age, so that as they're being socialized, there's also space for them to sort of critically engage with the messaging that they're receiving. So the way it's structured is it's a multi-year program, and we tried it in a range of different ways. So, we tried a club model initially when we piloted it, where students could opt into the program. We also tried a model where it was just in the mainstream curriculum of schools, like a math or science or, biology class. And we found that there was real value in engaging with all students rather than just a self-selecting group of students who chose to be in the program, because we found that it was often students who had been bullied or marginalized in some form who joined the club. while in the classroom where it was a part of the mainstream curriculum, it had a group of students, including students who hadn't previously grappled with or confronted some of these issues. And it was often by engaging in dialogue across both groups that we were actually able to see shifts within the classroom. And there's, a reduction in the incidence of bullying. There's just greater empathy and sort of respect and inclusion within some of those classrooms. So the way the program is structured is in a 3-term model. The first term is really focused on the self, so understanding your own identity, different dimensions. We think about identity in an intersectional way. So how do you grapple with different aspects of your own identity? Where are you in a position of privilege as a result of your identity? What gives you power? But also, have there been aspects of your identity that have led to marginalization? And the reason we start with the self is for students to engage with this issue in a way where they feel a sense of ownership or a sense of, this is an issue that also affects us. Because I think there's a way to do it in which it feels like this is a problem that doesn't relate to me or doesn't concern me. And we found that starting with the self has helped students feel like a greater stake in some of the issues. And then in the second term, we have conversations around, which is more focused on sort of media and society and how some of those things impact the experiences of a range of different identity groups. So we have classes on things like books inequality or film inequality. And the idea is not to tell students, don't read these books or don't watch those films, but just to say, representation of identity groups it's just the representation of that filmmaker or that author. It doesn't, like, you don't need to accept it as given, and there's that space to sort of critically examine that representation. So students are able to, as they receive messaging, engage with it so it doesn't unconsciously translate into certain attitudes, which then results in behaviors and practices. And then we don't want students to, like, it's definitely not a space of like gloom and doom of these are all the problems in the world and there's sort of nothing that we can do about it. I really wanted it to be an empowering space, because I think, one thing I was often told when I was much younger is, this is just how India is. That was sort of like when I asked a question, that was the response. And I think I wanted students to feel a sense of, just feel like they can challenge the status quo and should, right? They should be able to sort of construct the world they want to live in. So in the third term, what we do is we bring in a whole range of different creative facilitators, and they could be artists or theater performers or writers, and essentially give students the opportunity to take action in any form they choose. And the reason we've engaged with the arts is we found that it's often a less threatening way to engage with some of these issues. So we've had students develop comic books that examine everyday racism and sexism in their lives, or students who have created art installations in the city where you can walk through it and experience what it's like to face street or sexual harassment, and then there's a debrief after the fact. Or students have sort of created their own class constitutions or school constitutions of ways in which they want to engage with one another. And it's often been quite just like wonderful to see what they come up with. I remember, because bullying was quite a challenge in one of the classes, they came up with this rule of, we'll stand up to bullying even if it's our best friend who is involved with the bullying. So, and what we found is that the action that they've taken has led to internal transformation. Like, students have often shared, when they have shared stories of challenges that they've experienced within the classroom. So when I was talking about the first term where we deal with the self, students have shared all kinds of challenges that they faced even within the classroom. So a Muslim boy sharing that, if there was a terrorist act on TV, students, like, as a joke or what they perceived as a joke, saying, oh, are those your cousins, or are those your brothers? Or students being made fun of because of the color of their skin or different aspects of their identity. And I think often what has happened when students have had those conversations within the classroom is they've recognized that words have impact and can be harmful. So I think they've been able to sort of move beyond what they might have initially perceived as a joke to just being much kinder and more empathetic. And we found that that action has translated not just into the classroom being a more respectful and empathetic space, but they've been able to take that action into the school as a whole, also into the communities that they live around. And because you raised parents, like we've also had like mothers come to us and say, my marriage is more equal as a result of the program, with students sort of going back home and questioning things like, why does my mom cook all the meals? Can my father be involved with cooking even one meal a week and things like that? And I think what it's resulted in is not like children going and like sort of dictating how their household should operate, but I think what it's done is, provided students with the language and ability to just raise the questions, and then for each household to sort of come up with, whatever the answers might be. And in terms of the question that you said, like, has there been pushback by parents or, other stakeholders? I think one thing that I found is that I think the process in which you do things really informs whether there's resistance or not. So, initially when we started the program, our focus very much was on just working with children because, like I said, I wanted to focus on prevention. But then there could be, just say if we're having conversations about gender or the gender spectrum or other things, or students then going home and raising certain questions at home. And I think if parents felt unprepared to answer those questions or weren't sure where the questions were coming from, that might have raised concerns. So what we've done, and has been actually really helpful, is, we recognize that as schools of equality facilitators, we're only one part of a student's life and a sort of smaller part than their parents and teachers. So just sort of like bringing parents and teachers into the journey and into the process. And I think it's a lifelong journey for all of us. Like I think the schools of equality model is very much students and teachers being co-learners in the process, and us sort of learning and evolving together, and bringing parents and teachers into that co-learning process has often been really helpful. So we do an orientation for parents at the start of the year where we actually do some of the exercises we do with their children with them and explain to them what the purpose of the program is, the kinds of conversations we'll be having with their children. And we found that's been really, really helpful then, because when they go home, there's the space for them to continue to have some of those conversations, even with their parents.
I think the work Schools of Equality has done and continues to do is tremendous. I know you said that it is only a small part of their life, but the way I see it, I think it is definitely creating a huge impact in the lives of these students. So, building on this, I just wanted to get a better sense of the way your organization measures the impact of these workshops. So, you mentioned that some of the students have come up with some sort of art or like comic books, but can you please elaborate, on some of the ways through which Schools of Equality measures the impact of the workshops conducted?
I think it's often easier to measure things like the number of workshops that you do, or and it's harder to measure things like to what extent have attitudes shifted. But that's been what we have tried to measure. And so what we do is we do a baseline program, a baseline survey at the start of the year, and a base endline survey at the end of the year, as well as at the end of the 3-year mark. And what the baseline survey does is it measures shifts in 3 things. So it measures shifts in knowledge, in attitudes, and practices. So and then so you sort of start with where they're at on those 3 markers, and then where they end up. And we found quite a big shift on all of those 3 things. And then in addition to the surveys, what we do is more sort of qualitative discussions. So in terms of feedback forms from the students, from the teachers, from the school in general, and and that often has been really helpful anecdotally, even in seeing the shifts that happen within the classroom, not just in terms of, as you said, the action they take, but what does that classroom look like, not just when someone from schools of equality is there, but in terms of their engagement with one another just regularly in other classes as well.
We know that you hold two positions. First, as the acting director of Human Rights Clinic at Columbia Law School, and second, as the director of Schools of Equality in India. So, how do you manage your role between these two positions? Given the one obvious thing, which is the time difference.
Yeah, so so what I teach, just to provide the context, co-teach a class called the Human Rights Clinic at Columbia, and what that class is it's an experiential class, which has both a seminar and a project work component. And the seminar it's a skills-based seminar, so students learn the core skills that a human rights advocate would use, whether it's interviewing or fact finding or writing reports or other advocacy documents, or engagement with the media or government or the UN or other systems. And then they apply the skills they learn in the seminar to projects around the world. And ever since I started teaching at Columbia, of course I'm still involved with Schools of Equality, but more in an advisory capacity than being involved in a day-to-day basis. And I think sort of a leadership lesson that I'd learned a long time ago, or something that I tried to sort of has been a part of my practice with Schools of Equality even before I started teaching at Columbia, is like, how do I create projects or initiatives or organizations such that ideally I am redundant at the end of the process. And the vision of an institution is not limited to just me and my imagination, but the imagination and vision of the others that I sort of bring into the process. So we have a fantastic team of people from a whole host of other disciplines, and I feel like they're just such an incredible, inspiring set of people that are essentially running the show with Schools of Equality. But I see connections between the work that I do in both spaces, and a lot of the work that I did at Schools of Equality has informed the work that I do at Columbia. So, for instance, one thing that the clinic that I'm teaching emphasizes is it's not just about what we do or what forms of advocacy we engage with, but also how we do it. So what are the values that underlie the work that we do? Who leads the process? So it should be ideally impacted individuals and communities that lead the work, and have the agency to lead the work, rather than students located in the global north sort of going in, designing a project, implementing a project, leaving. And in addition to discussing some of those critiques of the human rights field and the ways in which actors in the global north have operated in the global south, I think another big piece of it has been, how do you have conversations around identity? How do you think about your own role as a lawyer, your own identity in some of the work, and how do you do some of that reflection and inner work around identity while trying to effect external systemic change in the world as advocates? So I think it has been really helpful to have already done a lot of that work around identity, and to be able to bring in some of those conversations with clinic students here.
What is your vision with regards to Schools of Equality? Essentially, what is the next step for you or the organization as a whole?
Yeah, so we've been having a lot of those visioning conversations actually over the last few weeks, because now in the upcoming academic year, we're able to be physically back in schools again, which is really, really exciting. But we're also continuing some of the other work that we had done. So during the pandemic, but even before that, in addition to working with students, we had also begun to do teacher training workshops, working with government school teachers and things like that. So a lot of that work is also going to continue. We've begun also working with companies, so which is not something we had planned to do, but companies sort of began to reach out to us and say, we have issues in terms of who is represented in leadership positions, or even if you're thinking about having more diverse workspaces, which is, and we talk about this in the context of schools as well. Like, I think companies, schools, institutions have begun talking about, say, diversity, but you can get people into a space and you can have higher numbers, but what do you do to ensure that you're creating a work culture where people feel able to fully participate? So how do you sort of create that environment? So we've been working with companies as well to do that. So we've worked now with a really wide range of stakeholders, and I think the vision really of the organization continues to be, how do we create spaces for people to engage in conversations about identity, equality, so that they are able to then feel empowered to generate whatever change they need to in the spaces that they occupy, alongside, of course, the internal transformation that happens. And also, how do we do this in a way? How do we create these spaces that are spaces of openness and non-judgment, right? I think that it's becoming increasingly hard to engage in conversation across difference or across identity groups. And, I think one thing Schools of Equality has been able to do is, how do you construct an environment where these conversations can happen from a space of respect?
Although you've moved to the advisory role at Schools of Equality, I really hope that you continue to make the same level of impact that you already have so far. Before we wrap up, given that you have a background in law and public policy, what are some of the lessons or advice that you would want to share with the young aspiring lawyers or policy enthusiasts in India or around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share. I mean, often I find that it's a lot of the wisdom is wisdom that I've received from my students over the years. And I think one of the reasons I choose to teach is so I can be a lifelong learner. But I'm happy to share some of the lessons I've received from mentors or students and others that I've worked with along the years. I think one thing that has been really helpful is to think about, if you're in a space where the horizon is murky and it's kind of unclear what the path forward is, often that's the place that you should be, where there's clearly a challenge, but the solution is not clear. I think that's the space for innovation, and that's the space for transformative change and potentially far-reaching change. So I think, my advice to people would be not to shy away from that, but to kind of lean into that space so that they're able to generate the change that they'd like to create. And I think in order to do that, it's often important to surround yourself by the right people. And when I say the right people, I mean people who inspire you to take action, or sort of spaces where people sort of support and uplift one another. I think another lesson that I would share with people is just, how do the work is challenging, but how do you create moments for joy and inspiration in the work? And often that is tied to the same theme of, who do you surround yourself by? I think one of our project partners often says, the work is really hard, but at the end of a long day, how do we make sure that there's also time for fun, to like eat a nice meal together, or exchange poetry that's significant to each other? So I think it's, how do you make time for those moments of joy and inspiration, I think is important. And I think, just recognizing, like, constantly, I think it's helpful to also sort of trust your gut and your instincts about issues, and have a plan, and be strategic and reflective, and think about things before you act. But I think it's also equally important to be open to critique and challenge, and to continually kind of learn and grow and evolve. And then finally, I think, just because, a lot of students often raise, what do we do immediately after law school or after policy school? And I think, you can look at other people's career, and sometimes it can feel like it all makes sense. You can like look back and connect the dots, but it's often been one experience that has led to another experience that has led to another, right? So I think just sort of doing whatever it is that you are excited about, because I think the field itself can shift and change entirely. I'm now a clinical teacher, and I didn't even know what a clinic was when I was a law student. So I think sometimes it's helpful to have a plan, but what can happen can sometimes be even more exciting than what you plan for yourself. So I think sticking to a plan, but also being open to possibility and change, and also sort of, maybe even just creating opportunities that didn't exist.
Golika, although your life story itself is really inspiring for the audience, but still thank you for sharing those wise words with me and the audience. And I really hope people can keep these words with them to create the impact that they want to in the world out there.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Akash. Thank you for your time. And it was just so wonderful to speak with you. And I think the work that all of you are doing is so wonderful. So it was just a really nice opportunity to be able to get to know you and the work that all of you are doing a little bit more as well.
Thank you so much, Goleka, for sharing your experiences and insights with us. It was really compelling to know more about human rights and how we are progressing towards a more just society. To our audience, I hope you had a great time listening to the episode, and we will be back with a new speaker soon. Till then, do subscribe to Carnegie India's YouTube channel for viewing similar content, and thank you so much.